So there's this famous hadith that many Muslim anti-Semites like to quote from. Again, Joel says, note that it is speaking specifically about, quote, the last hour. So Islam has their own highly specialized, detailed version of end-time events, eschatology, right down to the 7-year time frame. They've got a description. And I believe, as I interject before we read Joel Richardson's quote here, I believe that the reason that Islam has that built into their eschatology, their model of end-time events, which is what the word eschatology means in case you were lost, I believe that one of the reasons they have that is because the writers of the Quran and the compilers of the hadith materials actually borrowed from biblical resources. In fact, in one place of the Quran, I believe it is, or it might be the hadith, one of the hadith resources, there's actually a direct quote from the book of Revelation, which is really interesting. All right, let's read this quote. This is from, I believe it's from one of the hadith resources. Quote, "The last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, 'Muslim, or the servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him.' But the tree, Garchad," I'm probably butchering that Arabic phrase there, the tree would not say, 'For it is the tree of the Jews.'" So this is just to inform you of some of the details that are captured within religious Islamic writings and resources. I do not believe that these anti-Semitic sentiments are shared universally across all Muslims and those who follow after the religion of Islam. To be sure, many Muslims are friends and friendly towards Israel, friendly towards Jewish people and those who practice the Jewish religion, etc., depending on which country you are talking about, because Islam exists in nearly every country in the world, just like Judaism does, or I think Islam exists in many, many more, obviously, much, much more than Judaism does. Islam is fast becoming the world's top religion, the world's largest religion. But to the degree that Muslims and Jews interact with one another, there's largely peace and amicable relationship between the two people groups and religions for the most part, at least on the surface level. So the particular sentiments that we read about are probably only reserved for the extremists, people who are radicalized, perhaps maybe, who would seek to come to the perspective where there can be no peace between these two religions. Now, unfortunately, once we reach the point in time of history where the Antichrist is in a seat of world power and he begins to have free reign and exert his influence over the rest of the world to the point where he starts to persecute Jews and Christians at the midpoint, at that point in time, his world power will already be recognized as radical. It will already be a radicalized form of, if it's Islam, it will be a radical form of Islam that seeks to execute the words that we just read to an extreme or to exacting detail, where Jews should be put to death and should be wiped out, etc. Because why? It's not really Islam's hatred for Judaism, at least that's not what I suspect as a non-Muslim. I instead believe that it's driven by Satan's intense hatred for the Jewish people and for Israel and for genuine Christians and for God and for God's Messiah. That's really the driving force behind the anti-Semitism, not just within Islamic circles that will take place one day, but ultimately that's the core that drives all anti-Semitism in the world today and anti-Judaism, right? You have to recognize that it's Satan's hatred for God's people, the saints, the holy ones, Israel and her offspring, the Christians. It's Satan's intense hatred for God's people that drives people to have this irrational hatred towards the Jewish people. Let's keep reading Joel Richardson. We've got about 10 minutes left in our study. Joel says, after commenting on this particular hadith, several Muslim authors will be quick to point out the very interesting fact that this particular tree, I'm going to try it once again. I believe it's Garkad or Garquad. I don't think it's Qua. I think it's Garkad, but I'll look it up later on and then see if I can pronounce it. But that particular tree, you can see the spelling there, Gharqad. These Muslim authors are quick to point out, apparently the boxwood tree is what Joel says. This tree is presently being planted in abundance by Jews in Israel. Right? That's kind of interesting fact. Joel goes on to say that the point is that this final Holocaust is expected by Muslims to take place within the present state of Israel. Right? That's kind of scary, because if you think about it, for a long time, Israel didn't even exist as a people group after the expulsion from Jerusalem in the 130s of the Common Era. And so it wasn't until till God brought them back in the 1940s, what was it, 1948, when the state of Israel became recognized and was seen as a people group that would dwell in the land of Israel and have her own land once again. So it's the modern state of Israel that this eschatological aspect of religious writings within the Islamic circles is targeting. It isn't really ancient Israel per se that this prophecy was concerned with. I mean, you have to remember, when did Islam come to power? When did the Islamic Caliphate come to power? When did the Ottoman Empire come into world power and position? It was in the middle of what we call the gap, the church age, in Daniel's prophetic 490-year time frame, right? The 77s. The time in which Islam came to power was when Israel was already outside of her land. She was already exiled. So the prophecies that we read about in Quranic circles and within the hadiths that were recorded afterwards, they couldn't really have been focusing on Israel as a modern state, because there wasn't a modern state. There were Jewish people that were living in and amongst different places in the Middle East, but not to the degree that we recognize them like today as the state of Israel. So the point that Joel brings up is that this final Holocaust that Islamic prophecies are referring to is expected by Muslims to take place within the present state of Israel. The present state of Israel. This, of course, he says, corresponds to another very specific similarity between the biblical Antichrist and the Mahdi, right? The Antichrist, as we're going to read about later on, when we get to the book of Revelation studies, his persecutions against the Jewish people are prophesied to take place within a state of Israel, a people group, not from Daniel's perspective that had not yet been exiled, but by the time we get to the apostolic scriptures and Yeshua is warning Israel and his disciples and the people who would read the apostolic scriptures about what's coming in the future, Yeshua eventually gave the details to John, the gospel writers, and to Paul and then to John. The Spirit of Yeshua, the Holy Spirit, gave the details that would correspond with us understanding that Israel would be exiled out of her land, right, after 70 AD's destruction of the temple, the 130s, and the expulsion of the Jewish people, and the plowing under of Jerusalem, and the renaming of it to Aelia Capitolina. All of that would take place and result in a people group having to come back before the Antichrist and his events would unfold. So let's now begin to peel back some of the details about the military aspect of this religious ruler. It's not all religions, the point I'm trying to focus on now. A military attack against Israel and the establishment of the Temple Mount as the seat of authority. We have to remember that the Antichrist is not just a military leader. In Islamic circles, perhaps he has a lot of military clout and a lot of military interest. A lot of religious clout and a lot of religious interest. Remember, one of his nicknames in Islamic circles is the 12th Imam. And the word Imam, I-M-A-M, refers to a religious leader. Well, according to the biblical model, the Antichrist is not just a religious figure. To be sure, as I understand him, his religious aspect is only going to take him halfway through the 70th week, the 7-year time frame. Up until that point, he will allow religion, other religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all the other world religions. He'll tolerate them up to a point, and then he'll turn on them and impose his own one world religion. But it won't really be religion. It will really be a form of despotism, right? A form of a total one world government that just allows religion to be utilized kind of on a surface level. It's not real devotion that he's kind of after in that sense. I mean, yes, the devil wants people to worship him, but the point I'm trying to emphasize is that the devil seems to focus more of his energy on death and destruction and pain and suffering and anything he can do to cause not just God to suffer. He thinks that that's what's going on, but to ultimately cause people to suffer. And we do suffer under the devil's schemes and plans, right? He promises peace and joy and happiness, but he only brings death and pain and destruction, right? He never really pays out. Maybe temporarily, you do get some of those payoffs, right? There's a temporary payoff to sin, but it's just that it's temporary. So let's read about the military attack against Israel and the establishment of the Temple Mount as the seat of authority. We'll take a bite out of this. We may not finish this. Let me see how long this section goes, since we'll have about 4 minutes left. Scrolling down through. Yeah, I can already see that it's a bit longer, so we'll just get started in this particular section, and we'll pick this up again next week. So this is Joel Richardson once again. The Bible teaches that the Antichrist, with his multi-nation coalition, will attack Israel and specifically Jerusalem to conquer it. So he wants to set up his seat of authority there, which, as far as I understand, will include a military presence there in Jerusalem, a religious presence in Jerusalem, but he'll probably have a good amount of his military machine hidden away somewhere, right? Maybe somewhere in Turkey or somewhere in Iraq or Iran or Russia or somewhere else in that ring of nations that kind of surrounds Israel 1,000 miles in every direction, right? Which is largely Muslim controlled. So we read a quote here. It says, "I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it." This is the Old Testament book of Zechariah, I believe. "The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people," that is, those who submit to Antichrist's rule, according to Joel Richardson, "will not be taken from the city." And then, just as I mentioned, it's Zechariah 14:2. We have another quote from Ezekiel that we need to read here that reads, "You," that is Gog, Ezekiel's name for the Antichrist. So "you, O Gog, will go up. You will come like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops and many peoples with you." So we're talking about, again, a campaign against Jerusalem. The Bible says, "Thus says the Lord God, it will come about on that day," that, by the way, the phrase "on that day" is your clue to know that this is talking about the end time events that we would associate with the day of the Lord. Remember, I mentioned in previous teachings that when you're reading through Old Testament prophecies, when God wanted to signify that the events that he's speaking of, that he's foretelling, are going to either have a near far aspect, a now and not yet fulfillment, a partial and a total fulfillment, where there's maybe a what we might call foreshadow fulfillment within some form of exile on Israel's part, or persecution from a world power outside of Israel, like Babylon or Assyria or the Medes and the Persians or the Greeks, the Romans, or someone like that. We had a partial fulfillment, but yet there is a total final fulfillment in the end of days. Then the Bible will often signal this shift from the time of Israel when the prophet was writing to the end times, in which we're living now. It'll signal this shift using terminology like on that day, or in that day, or at that time, or it'll specifically say the Lord's day, or it'll come about in that day. So we have Ezekiel doing the same thing. It'll come about on that day. Which day? The day of the Lord, which is not really just one day, even though it uses the word yom there in Hebrew. The word day there contextually refers to a time frame. It could be 24 hours, could be a little longer than 24 hours. And in this case, the day of the Lord indicates the day of God pouring out his wrath upon the wicked people of humanity who have yielded their allegiance to the Antichrist. And so it's a form of punishment and a form of cleansing the earth of that wickedness of that day. So the day of the Lord. All right, so what Ezekiel is describing is that on that day, he's referring to on the day of the Lord, or in the time of the end, which on a calendar would look like, on the 7th week calendar, would look like something around the midpoint of the week or later, the midpoint of the week. 3/4 of the way in, so corresponding to the time of what I'm describing as the pre-wrath rapture, or the snatching away of the people of God, and or the pouring out of God's wrath in the beginning of the intense trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments that we've read in the book of Revelation. This is what we call Day of the Lord. So on that day, on the day of the Lord, Ezekiel continues that thoughts will come into your mind, speaking of Gog, speaking of Antichrist. I'm going to finish this paragraph and then we'll call it quits for this part of our study tonight, since we're finished with our time frame. It'll come about on that day that thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil plan. And you will say, these are the thoughts of the Antichrist. These are the thoughts of Gog, another name for Antichrist in the Old Testament. That you will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. Speaking of the Jewish people dwelling securely in the land of Israel, specifically Jerusalem. And why would they have security? Because 3.5 years earlier, they signed a peace treaty with the Antichrist to have this non-aggression between them and their Muslim/Arab neighbors. And so they're dwelling somewhat peacefully because the Antichrist has brokered this peace treaty. So it makes sense that I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those, Ezekiel says, who are at rest, that live securely, all of them living without walls, and Ezekiel says, having no bars or gates to capture, spoil, and to seize plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the people, that is the Israelites, Joel says, that's his little insert there, the Israelites who are gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and goods, who live how? At the center of the world. That's Ezekiel 38, 9 through 12, according to the NASB. So, as we're drawing our study to a close, what we're learning and what we've learned tonight is that the Antichrist is going to, at the midpoint of the week, begin to ramp up his persecution against Jews and Christians. He's going to seek to establish his headquarters in Jerusalem and to begin his worldwide persecution of Jews and Christians from Jerusalem, taking it over as his headquarters. He's going to throw off any religious ties to whatever world religion was being tolerated at that time, whether it be Islam or Judaism or Christianity or some collaboration of a coexisting type one world religion. And he's going to begin to use his military power to establish himself as the one world ruler, the one deity over all the earth, the one God of all the earth, implementing the mark of the beast, the one world monetary system, more banking system, giving his full power to the 10-nation coalition that he's already put together, etc., etc. We're going to be reading more and more about these details of how they correspond with, in parallel fashion, to the description of the Mahdi, the premier Islamic world religious leader, who from their perspective is also going to usher in worldwide Islamic rule so that world peace can be established under the guise of a one world religion known as Islam. But that'll do it now for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.